At midnight, someone walked the eastern gallery in shoes that made no sound, and where their shadow should have fallen, there was only moonlight and a thin, wrong-smelling fog. Prince Idris had been taught that kingdoms were arithmetic, taxes in, soldiers out, laws balanced against the noise of neighbours. He ran a tidy court, traded in tidy orders, and learned the rhythms of his father's palace like the lines of a ledger. Yet late in the warm month, when jasmine leaned into open windows, and the river under the city moved like a quiet promise, something slipped the ledger from his hands. It began with the sound, a bell that should have hung nowhere. One night, as Idris walked the gallery to see how the guards fared, a single note threaded through the stone. It wasn't a bell anyone could find. Servants said it was a dream. Guards said wind. Idris said nothing, and followed the note into the courtyard. Beneath the orange tree, the air smelled of washing starch and of night-blooming jasmine, and she was there, kneeling, hands folded around a basin, the bowl reflecting the moon. Her hair was the colour of wet earth, and her eyes had the startled, honest quality of someone who believed the world still made sense. She wore the plain linen of a scullery maid, and her name, so the housekeeper whispered later, was Myrina. Myrina danced around the palace like a small, attentive moon. She carried trays, wiped the prince's boots clean without being asked, laughed at jokes she had heard for the 100th time as if they were new. Idris found himself making excuses to pass the kitchen door. He would stop idly to watch her tie a knot, or straighten a pile of clean linens. When she looked up, the world tilted. When she smiled, his breath shortened like a man catching a foolish, dangerous bird. That was the ordinary, an ordinary that had its own rules. Royals were meant to know a dozen languages and 100 treaties. Romance was meant to be a thing, discussed by ministers and weighed as risk. No rule book contained a ladder out the window to the echo of a borrowed bell. The first sign that things were wrong came when servants began to complain of cold in rooms the winter sun had just warmed. Dishes slid from hands that had tightened at some unseen sound. Linen left on the racks was damp with dew in the morning. Once, a tray of candles split and cracked, as if struck by invisible fingers. Idris wrote it off as fatigue. Myrina offered him bread and a sly smile, and the world shrank to two simple absolutes, her laughter and the soundless bell. He was not alone in the noticing. The palace had ears, and the ears had voices. Old women who had worked under 3 kings whispered that the jasmine that bloomed when Myrina stepped into a room was wrong. Jasmine was welcome, yes, but not the way it sighed against the stone as if it were part of her breath. The steward, a man with calloused fingers and soft eyes, noted that keepers of the records had crossed out certain names that no one had told the prince to notice. The royal doctor frowned at the prince's pallor and said Idris should eat more meat and less worry. Idris did not hear him. He had learned the sound of Myrina's footfalls, paper-thin, like the brushing of silk. He began to prefer those to the sound of statecraft. On the 8th night after the bell first rang, Idris followed Myrina into the eastern gallery. She moved like someone used to moving unseen, between pillars, under portraits, past tapestries whose eyes seemed to track her. She knelt by a painted portrait of a woman in a silver dress and pressed her hand to the glass. Mirrors use truth. Portraits keep a version that doesn't change. Myrina pressed her palm until the glass steamed, and a single voice, his voice, found him in that blank space between curiosity and warning. Don't follow me into what was burned. He drew back. Myrina turned. She saw him, and the world that had been shrinking swelled with immediate joy. "Why are you watching me, my lord?" she asked. Her voice was perfectly ordinary. Her smile, too, could have been taken apart and filed under harmless her ordinary, That first week became his devotion. He brought her stories from his travels, little fragments of foreign markets and jars of preserves, until courtiers began to murmur. The Queen Mother watched them with clever, tired eyes. A prince flirting with a maid was not a scandal. It was a precarious amusement. But when the jasmine kept blooming at Marina's elbows, when the bell returned at night, and servants began to dream of fire in hallways they had walked 1,000 times, the court's amusement curdled into watchfulness. Idris felt an unease that he could not name. He began to walk the palace in the hours between midnight and dawn, counting tiles and tracing the stone seams with his fingertips, as if his hands might read whether the building had a heart. The bell rang again one midnight. He followed it, but this time the note came from the inner kitchens, the place where old things went to tend the lines between life and death. There Mirena stood without warning, humming. When he reached for her, she vanished. A trick of the draught or his own appetite, the steward said. But in the hearth, a roast that had been placed to cool hollowed and crumbled like old bread. A charcoal mark blackened Idris's sleeve in a pattern that looked disturbingly like a handprint. By the end of Act 1, the palace had been tugged from ordinary life into something that wore a familiar face, but moved like a thing made of night. Idris's affection had a sweetness to it, yes, but hovering in that sweetness was a prickle of warning. The bell, the jasmine, the evaporating bread. The ordinary had become uncanny, and the prince, naively in love, was the first to miss the danger. If Myrena's presence carried the perfume of jasmine, then her absence left a chill that pushed into the bones. Servants started disappearing for hours, and returning with their sleeves damp and their eyes hollower, as if a portion of them had been left in the western storeroom. A favourite hound of the prince refused water for 3 days, and then whimpered, and left the palace to die in the gardens. Birds roosted at the rafters, and then jettisoned in the night, singed at the wingtips. The palace echoed with small escalations at first, a window that bled fog onto the sill, a lap of blue flame over a candle that flared and went out. Then the things sharpened. Mirrors clouded and showed other rooms. Servants spoke to shadows as if they were answering children, and a chapel bell tolled when no one had touched the rope. Idris refused logic. He said, "Love is honest, love is kind." He doubled the work of crown and code to bury the cold. Mirena knelt and plaited his hair with the tenderness of a sister or a lover. He could not tell which. She bent to the fire and drew patterns on the ash with her finger, and when he asked what the patterns meant, she told him they were the names of things she wanted to keep. One night she whispered words that tasted of smoke and ruin, and made him feel like a man who had been found in a library after a city had burned. It was the priest who first named the danger, Father Hanan, who had kept the royal icons for longer than Idris had been alive. He was a man who smelled faintly of wax and loam, who moved slowly, because each step was a prayer. When the steward brought him the stories, candles extinguished, a child in the nursery hearing laughter when no one laughed, he came to the prince and said plainly, "There are guests in the rooms who do not speak in the living tongue." Idris's first impulse was irritation. How dare an elderly priest use such language with him? But there is a language younger men do not possess, the language of the old ways. Father Hanan knelt before a small brazier and fed it with the root of a bitter bark. He did not speak until the smoke formed across through the skylight. "There is a binding," he said, "a woman held in the old way. She steps in and she steps out. When she steps, she brings the memory of a thing the palace owes her." "The palace owes nothing," Idris snapped. "Mirena, she is nothing but a maid. She cleans. She laughs. She rests when she is tired." Father Hanan's eyes, pale and milky, did not leave Idris's face. No living maid can walk from portrait to hearth with the ease she does unless something else, something older, moves her. You have seen a bell, my prince, a bell not hung of wood or iron. You have smelled jasmine in places where it does not grow. Those are signs Idris could have turned him away. He did not. Instead, he brought Father Hanan to the Eastern Gallery, to the portrait that Myrena visited, to the glass that steamed. The priest laid his hand upon the painting and did what priests do. He spoke for a name that could not answer. The portrait's painted eyes, older than memory, had a scar through the corner like a map. Father Hanan traced it and said softly, "She was burned." Burned. The court would have kept that name in a folder with other hostile things, witch, traitor, madwoman, if only Idris had nodded and ordered the matter quiet, but he did not. Love closes things. Love also opens them. He sought Myrena and asked, "That picture is of my cousin," she said, and the words fell like a plate in a sink. She married into a house that had fires in its name. They called her kind. She burned before the child could be weaned. Idris's chest hollowed. This was the first genuine thing she had told him, a shard that could be weighed. He wanted to hold her and forbid any priest to name her wrong. The court whispered. The steward's ledger added a line. A guard refused first watch duty and said very quietly, "I hear a baby cry in the linen store at night." And then shock. A little boy, the son of the head gardener, well known for his pranks, vanished from his bed. The guards found his blanket at the foot of the stable, with a ring of ashes around the edge. The child was not dead, he was gone. His father screamed for the prince, and the palace did what palaces always do when they are afraid. It gathered. Faces pressed into corridors, teeth shone more than smiles. The crowd, previously only background, became a force. They called for explanations and for answers, and for the prince to arrest the maid. Idris refused arrest. He made Parliament a feeling and said, "I will not bind the woman I love without knowing what is in her heart." He sent the guards away with a look that was meant to be kingly and settled Myrena into his private apartments, with candlelight and a coffer of silks. The act of sheltering her was a mistake the palace would catalogue later. Night fell, heavy as wool. Father Hanan did not leave. He sat by the door and watched like a man who understood that a door is both invitation and boundary. The jasmine clung to the window. Myrena came to the bed and sat on the floor and told Idris stories about a house by a river, where children learned to skip stones and fathers read maps by low flame. Her voice was a lullaby that remembered what had been lost. Then the bell rang, close and sharp as a knife by the ear. The air went still. Myrena rose to answer it. There was another face, a woman with hair threaded in ash, her cheeks scarred with a seam of healed burns, one eye milky. She mouthed a single word Idris could not hear. Father Hanan broke the silence. "A binding," he said again. "Someone tied a sorrow to the house and called it by name. It seeks to complete what was burned." Panic moved through the palace like a draught. Servants bolted doors. The steward ordered the gates shut. The crowded kitchen sent up a smell of pot roast and fear. The prince, who had thought of love as a simple arithmetic, had to choose between sheltering the woman who fit his hand and listening to the folk who had watched the palace like a patient watching for fever. When Idris declared that Myrena would stay, 100 eyes narrowed. The crowd outside the private apartments became not only vigil, but accusation. The gardener's son had not returned. Whispers grew teeth and bit the quiet. Stones were hurled at shutters. Someone left a ribbon on the palace steps soaked in ash. Then the real escalation. The prince's younger sister, a girl who liked to race along the parapets in the dawn, fell into a dream that would not let her wake. She spoke in a voice borrowed from someone else and insisted that she lived in flames, and that the air above the parapets tasted of cinders. Her hair smelled of smoke, though she had slept in fresh linen. At last, Father Hanan spoke with a steady hand and a hazardous thing. "We will force a truth from the house." He gathered a small band, a handful of guards, the steward, a woman who had been a midwife before she washed dishes, and took them into the galleries to the places where the bell had rung. The people who stayed behind hummed prayers like a dam. Idris, despite himself, went too. They came to the portrait and found an iron nail behind the frame, scorched and threaded with hair like a small desperate rope. There were burn marks on its corner where someone living or not, had pressed a palm to the likeness and demanded something back. Father Hanan found a scrap of cloth hidden in the frame, thin as paper, blackened at its edge. When he held it, the bell pealed from some other corridor, and the air tasted like copper. Curses tied by grief can look like kindness, he said, and there was no softness in his voice now. Someone once vowed that what was taken by fire would be returned in the house of the living. Curses do not differentiate between thief and heir. They answer love as gladly as greed. Idris's heart hammered. Love and greed, he thought of both as separate things. Marina sat upon a low stool and waited like someone attending a guest. Her hands rested in her lap. She looked ordinary, ridiculous, luminous, altogether human. But the palace smelled of ash, and the bell had a cadence like a clock counting down. "Let her go," the crowd chanted along the corridor beyond. "Let the maid go." Let the prince wake, Idris could not. He thought of the way her fingers had fit in his, the low timbre of her laughter. He thought of a ledger, and how some things are impossible to balance. Father Hanan proposed a confrontation that was part prayer and part test, a wake kept in the chapel, a ring of blessed salt, and the recitation of names until the living answered. The palace crowded into the nave, torches made twin shadows of the pillars. Idris sat by Marina and found his knees shaking in a way that had nothing to do with weather. The priest laid a palm on the prince's shoulder and said, "You have invited the house to speak. You will hear the truth. Hear it and decide what you will be." Marina's eyes glowed in the torchlight with that peculiar softness of someone who believes love repays all debts. The crowd was a tide of faces, farmers, scribes, guards, the Queen Mother with a pinched look that softened when she looked at her son. The gardener's wife, cheeks hollow, watched with a small, desperate hope. Father Hanan began. He recited the list of those missing, and those harmed, of names that had burned in the margins of the court's history. He called upon the spirits of the ground and asked what they would deliver. The chapel filled with the smell of smoke that had not been born of the present hearth. A wind moved the candles, though no open door was there. At a certain point, the place where disbelief thins into a line, the chapel roof shivered, and an image came like a spill across the ceiling. A woman in a silver dress moved across a corridor and did not step into the light but through it. Her hands, when she reached up, left circles of frost on the carved oaks. It was then, in that awful slow swing of truth, that Marina rose and spoke. "You should have let me go," she said, and her voice was layered. One voice sunk in the calm of the present, another ragged with the ache of what had been. "I am what they bound to the house when the fire took me. I came because they called a bell and called for me, and because he," she turned to Idris, "called my name with his, needing. I would not have come if he had not held the ledger of the house to the sun." Idris felt his world tilt. "What are you?" he demanded, though he already knew. Mirena's features moved, and for a moment his lover and some other thing overlapped. "I was Lala," she said, "once. They hung me with vows when the hearth caught the curtains. They said, if we cannot keep you, then we will bind you to the house until the debt is paid." A cold whispered through the chapel, as if the past had come in riding cloaked upon the present. The Queen Mother gasped. The gardener's wife made a sound like a prayer that had lapsed into longing. Father Hanan said. She was burned in the fire of House Dervan. The name was Lale. The rite tied her to what she loved, so she could not leave. She has been part of our walls since before my hand grew heavy with bone. Idris clutched at the fabric of a pew. You lied to me, he said to Mirena Lale. Call it the merging of names or the fracture of identity. He realised now the ledger had been wrong, not by arithmetic, but by omission. Love had been measured without considering what it took. Not all lies are meant to harm, Lale said. Some lie so they can be held. They are bindings. They are prayers made sticky with ash. Then the chapel doors rattled. The crowd outside, having grown to a boil, pushed through the nave in a wave of torches and voices. They wanted the maid. They wanted the prince to be wise. They wanted the lost gardener's boy. Panic flared like a bell. And then the final, terrible revelation. Father Hanan produced the scrap of blackened cloth from behind the portrait that had been hidden. He held it up to the light. On it, faint as the memory of rain, were two names sewn together, Lale and another. Idris read the other name, and his heart emptied into the chapel floor. It was his own surname, the old name of his family. An ancestor had married into the house that had burned Lola's kin. In the margins of history, the families had sown one another's debts with vows that never properly ended. What the prince thought a private, tender devotion was in fact something arranged long before his birth, a ledger of old sins seeking balancing. You see, Father Hanan said, his voice low like a knife, a curse is not necessarily a witch's curse. It can be a promise kept too long. A man swears to make something right, and 200 years later, a boy of my prince's age thinks he is being loved and is instead walking into the receipt for a debt. Idris felt a rage, fierce and bleak. He wanted to tear his own hands from his arms. He wanted to smash the portrait and to deny every story the palace kept. But it was not just his pride, it was the gardener's child's face that haunted him. The little blankness where a life should have been. He turned to Mirena Lale. Did you take him? He asked. The question was simple. She looked at him with a sadness that could break bone, and said nothing for a long time. When she spoke, it was like wind sifting through a ruin. I took what I was given. I sought to complete the thing that was not finished, because for 200 years I'd been told I must. I do not remember the boy as a thing of his own right. I remember him as an answer. I have been bound to answer. Shot crashed through the chapel like a thunderclap. Some shrieked. Men fell to their knees. The gardener made a sound he had not known he could make, half howl, half prayer, and slapped a trembling palm to his son's empty bed. Father Hanan rose, small and terrible. There is a way to untie what was tied, he said, but it asks for a cost that the house must pay. We can break a binding by returning what was promised, or by offering what was owed. A binding made with vows can be undone with truth, and with the burning of the thread used to tie it. But one must be willing to watch the thing that was loved go away. Idris thought of the prince he had been, neat in arithmetic. He thought of how quickly the ledger could tip. He had loved a face and now had to choose. Was love a possession, or was it the courage to let the harbour close? He called the crowd to silence. His voice caught. I will make the choice myself, he said. If what binds this woman to our house is a promise sewn with my family's name, then I will break it. The palace held its breath. Father Hanan set about his ritual. Salt in a ring, a basin of water, a bundle of ash-bound thread. Mirena Lale stood within the ring. The priest chanted in a language older than the palace ledger. The crowd watched, eyes like knives. Idris took the blackened scrap and the hair thread from the frame. It was small, a thing that could be lost in a cloak. He held it and felt the whole house like a mirror of his chest. He imagined setting it on fire. He imagined holding Mirena Lale's hand and letting her go. In the end, it demanded as these things often do, a living price. To untie what 2 centuries of promises had tied, someone must give up a name. Someone must set an old wound to air. Idris did not forget the gardener's child. He did not forget the hound or the queen mother's narrowed eyes. He thought of the ledger, his ledger, and realised his position was not a debt to be defended, but a responsibility to be paid. So he took a knife, a simple thing, and with a hand that did not tremble, he cut his own palm and let the blood fall onto the black thread in the basin. The prince's blood made the water ring a dark red. He said words Father Hanan repeated, as if the syllables themselves were a new sort of ledger. What once was promised to pain, we cut. What once was bound by ash, we give back to flame. Let what sought completion be released. Marina Lala looked at him with something that could have been gratitude, or that could have been a thing far older. The easing of a muscle that had been clenched for generations. Father Hanan burned the hair thread until it turned to grey and then ash, and in that hour the chapel went silent. The boy returned. He did not return as if he had been stolen, and then found, bright and as if nothing had happened. He returned with eyes like someone who had lived in a small box and seen only maps. His laughter took time to come back. The gardener wept and pressed the child to his chest and did not let go. Mirena Lale sat on the floor and caught the ash in her palm as if it were snow. Her skin shone like the inside of a shell. When she rose to her feet, she began to tremble, not of cold, but of a thing uncoiling. You will leave, she told Idris, and her voice was at once his lover's and a stranger's. I am not what you loved at first. I was never supposed to be the answer a boy or a state could give. Now you have undone what 2 centuries demanded. Keep your child, keep your ledger. But no, what you have cut was held to the house by wants that do not die easily. Idris found he could not offer her the room of his heart and the freedom she needed to walk away at once. He thought of everything, his neat orders, his arithmetic, the comfort of a measure, and for the first time in his life, he felt the sharpness of choosing. He walked with her to the eastern gate as dawn slotted between the city's roofs. The palace watched as if it were the last curious thing in the world. Mirena Lale paused by the orange tree and stroked its bark. Her hands were warm and then cool, as if she were moving through seasons. You must tell them, she said. Do not write again the promise that calls up the dead when they are living to bear the loss. He wanted to beg her not to leave. There are few prices men refuse to pay when they are afraid of empty hands, but he could not. The price had been paid. The child slept in the gardener's arms. The ash lay in a bowl in Father Hanan's hands. Mirena Lala looked at him as a woman who had been more shadow than shape and said, Do not make the ledger the only law of the house. Then she stepped past the gate into sunlight that seemed to rearrange the jasmine's scent into something honest. She did not look back. Where she walked, the air shimmered and then closed like a door. The bell that had rung for nights did not toll again. The palace exhaled, but its breath was ragged. People laughed with relief and mistrust in the same breath. The Queen Mother made a face that said she had lost something and gained nothing but a lesson. The steward wrote in his ledger and left margins that were blank, as if ashamed. Idris sat alone for a long time in the gallery and counted the stones. He had thought love was arithmetic and found it was something like sacrificial accounting. Some sums must be paid in living pain, others returned to ash. He had loved and had also been loved by a thing that was not entirely alive. Neither feeling had kept him warm. Both had left distinct and useful scars. He learned to listen for bells and to ask what they asked. Must give up a name. Someone must set an old wound to air. Idris did not forget the gardener's child. He did not forget the hound or the Queen Mother's narrowed eyes. He thought of the ledger, his ledger, and realised his position was not a debt to be defended, but a responsibility to be paid. So he took a knife, a simple thing, and with a hand that did not tremble, he cut his own palm and let the blood fall onto the black thread in the basin. The prince's blood made the water ring a dark red. He said words Father Hanan repeated, as if the syllables themselves were a new sort of ledger. What once was promised to pain, we cut. What once was bound by ash, we give back to flame. Let what sought completion be released. Marina Lala looked at him with something that could have been gratitude, or that could have been a thing far older. The easing of a muscle that had been clenched for generations. Father Hanan burned the hair thread until it turned to grey and then ash, and in that hour the chapel went silent. The boy returned. He did not return as if he had been stolen, and then found, bright and as if nothing had happened. He returned with eyes like someone who had lived in a small box and seen only maps. His laughter took time to come back. The gardener wept and pressed the child to his chest and did not let go. Mirena Lale sat on the floor and caught the ash in her palm as if it were snow. Her skin shone like the inside of a shell. When she rose to her feet, she began to tremble, not of cold, but of a thing uncoiling. You will leave, she told Idris, and her voice was at once his lover's and a stranger's. I am not what you loved at first. I was never supposed to be the answer a boy or a state could give. Now you have undone what 2 centuries demanded. Keep your child, keep your ledger. But no, what you have cut was held to the house by wants that do not die easily. Idris found he could not offer her the room of his heart and the freedom she needed to walk away at once. He thought of everything, his neat orders, his arithmetic, the comfort of a measure, and for the first time in his life, he felt the sharpness of choosing. He walked with her to the eastern gate as dawn slotted between the city's roofs. The palace watched as if it were the last curious thing in the world. Mirena Lale paused by the orange tree and stroked its bark. Her hands were warm and then cool, as if she were moving through seasons. You must tell them, she said. Do not write again the promise that calls up the dead when they are living to bear the loss. He wanted to beg her not to leave. There are few prices men refuse to pay when they are afraid of empty hands, but he could not. The price had been paid. The child slept in the gardener's arms. The ash lay in a bowl in Father Hanan's hands. Mirena Lala looked at him as a woman who had been more shadow than shape and said, Do not make the ledger the only law of the house. Then she stepped past the gate into sunlight that seemed to rearrange the jasmine's scent into something honest. She did not look back. Where she walked, the air shimmered and then closed like a door. The bell that had rung for nights did not toll again. The palace exhaled, but its breath was ragged. People laughed with relief and mistrust in the same breath. The Queen Mother made a face that said she had lost something and gained nothing but a lesson. The steward wrote in his ledger and left margins that were blank, as if ashamed. Idris sat alone for a long time in the gallery and counted the stones. He had thought love was arithmetic and found it was something like sacrificial accounting. Some sums must be paid in living pain, others returned to ash. He had loved and had also been loved by a thing that was not entirely alive. Neither feeling had kept him warm. Both had left distinct and useful scars. He learned to listen for bells and to ask what they asked, for he taught the court to watch for the small things, the smell of jasmine in winter, a bell that rings where no metal hangs. He made Father Hanan a keeper of rights and asked that no old promise be kept without a living witness. The gardener's child learned to skip stones again, slowly, and the palace repaired what could be repaired. There is a neat moral that the old women at the market would have told you in 3 proverbs. Do not answer a bell that has never been hung. Do not bind the dead with the living's promises. Do not let love become a ledger. If there is a warning in Idris's story for us who read at windows in the quiet, it is this. Listen to the small, uncanny things. A smell that shouldn't be there is as much a signal as a bell. Questions left unasked gather weight, and promises given to settle old debts will always ask for payment. Greed, whether for a name, an heir, or the comfortable lie that nothing is ever owed, will always summon a toll. Heed the sound in your own eastern gallery. If you hear a bell where no bell should be hung, if jasmine blooms in a storeroom in the middle of winter, do not answer it alone. Speak to your priests and elders, open your ledger and inspect the margins, and, above all, remember that to love something is sometimes to let it go.